Hello, welcome to the People Profit Podcast, the show where we flip the script on traditional business thinking and prove that when you put people first, profits follow. I'm Sandra Coker, your guide on this journey to more engaged teams, loyal customers, and a healthier bottom line. These episodes are brought to you by Human Power Solutions, helping organizations unlock the human potential that powers performance. Whether you're a leader, an HR pro, or a curious change maker, buckle up. We're diving into fresh stories, real-world strategies, and a few laughs along the way. Ready to turn your workplace into a profit-powered people machine? Let's get started. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Jeff Sigel to our podcast. Jeff is the CEO of Twinning Edge, a speaker, a coach, and the author of The Middle Matters, a toolkit for middle managers. How cool is that? He brings over 20 years of experience in management from companies like Nabisco, the Hershey Company, Stop and Shop, and Cracker Barrel. Jeff has lived and led through this often overlooked space between the executives and the frontline workers. And I love this conversation. I'm so excited to have it. He's also developed a fresh perspective on how organizations can support their middle managers to thrive. We're diving into his leadership journey, the concept of Doer, leader, influencer, and his unique leadership philosophy, which he calls the radical, extreme, highly effective, atomic ownership mindset. So let's get into it. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Sandy.
Yeah, really excited. So you and I met a few months ago, or maybe a month ago or so, when I was on a panel. And just in our conversations, it was just like, boom.
Yes.
Just, we live this life of middle management, right? It's how it is. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. And I want to start with the heart of your work, the middle management, right? So you've said, as we've been talking and going back and forth, you said that the middle managers are often promoted for their technical expertise. They're good at what they do. And now you're going to lead, and they have no tools for leadership, right?
Yeah. It's, so there's this fascinating thing that we do, right? We take, so I don't know why I always choose accounting, but like take accounting, like somebody's really good at accounting. And so we're like, oh, you're really good at this. So you're going to be really good at leading people doing it. And so we promote the people because they're really good at doing this thing. And then they are put in this job and we give them no skills and no training at all on how to do this. We call them soft skills. We sort of downplay them. They're not important, whatever. They're actually some of the hardest and most important skills that we have to have once we sort of move up. And so people are left sort of in this job and in this role where they are feeling like, wow, like if this were hard, somebody would have trained me how to do it. Right. So the fact that they didn't train me how to do it, must mean that must mean that it's easy. And because I'm finding it hard, there must be something wrong with me, which I'm convinced is like a whole, sort of part of the imposter syndrome thing is like you get put into a role, you're expected to, know how to do something that you've never been trained to do. It's just this, this weird thing that we just expect people to learn. And so what people default to is what I call marionetting, right?
Yep.
Going to do through others, right?
Yes.
And which doesn't really work, as you well know. And so for me, it's really all about, we have to start looking the skills that a middle manager needs to have. We need to actually start giving them a framework and a set of tools that they are able to use in order to do that role well.
I mean, I think that hits home for so many people. And I'm in companies, you're in companies, we're there all the time. And whenever I'm working with a middle management, team, I'm always like, you guys have the toughest job. You're managing up, you're managing down, you got to manage yourselves and you still have a job to do. It's really challenging. So you talk about the middle managers playing three roles, which is in that, I'm kind of diving into there.
Yeah.
They're the doer, right? They're the leader. And they're also trying to move the needle, right? And being the influencer.
Right.
Can you tell me about a time that maybe when you realized that you were stuck in just one of those roles and what happened when you shifted?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Let me first sort of spend a second on the doer leader influence
Yeah.
because this really is the heart of um kind of what I train and coach on is this idea that hey, when you're in the middle, you have three roles, and if you don't understand that you have those three roles, you are sort of just trying to. It's all this sort of like messy kind of what am I doing here? Um,
Middle, right?
so right, exactly. So I always talk about the doer role is the role that you have with respect to your boss, right? And the goal of that doer role is to create credibility with your boss. Do they believe that you can do the things you're going to you
Yeah.
say you can do or they've asked you to do, right? Um, and then the second role is the leader role, and that role is about the relationship between you and your team, and that role is really all about how do I create capacity? How do I get the most out of the team that is working for me? And the third role, the influencer role, is about you and your relationship with everyone else, your peers, other senior leaders, that you have no control over, but you have to influence.
Right. Yeah.
And and the goal there is you have to try and create commitment, right? Um, and so what I often find is that just sharing that framework with people is actually a really, really powerful training tool because you can actually get people to go, oh, now I see that this role is, the reason I was struggling with this role is because I'm trying to treat all these parts of this role as if they were the same.
Yep.
Um, but I mean, so you mentioned that I wrote a book. My whole book is like stories like what you're talking about of
Yeah.
me kind of like, wow, I'm in that situation. I don't know what I'm doing. What do I do now? But one of my the very first story I tell in the book was my very first time as a leader, meaning the first time I had a direct report. Um, and I talk in the book about this character. It's a real person, but I renamed him, right?
Right. Yeah, we've all done that.
A person named Travis, and Travis basically like pops into my office one day, and we had this sort of ongoing thing where he'd come into my office with the budget, and the budget wouldn't tick and tie, like the numbers wouldn't work out perfectly, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh, like what else is wrong? Like what does he miss? What's going on here? And I'm looking at it thinking it's sloppy, and so I said to him, I'm like, these numbers don't tick and tie. And he says to me, is this really the most valuable use of our time? And I, not to my credit, said, no, it's not. And if you got it right, we wouldn't spend any time, which was a really, really bad leadership moment. Um, and it's like,
That shop smell that we were talking about.
and, and so I watched him sort of leave my office, kind of shaking his head, going like, what is wrong with my boss? And I suddenly realized like, I have made this whole conversation about me and not about him.
Yeah.
There's something that I don't know. I don't understand how do I get him sort of enrolled in and engaged in doing this job. So to your question, I mean that like I said, my book is full of stories like that, but that's sort of the one that started it off for me. Like very early on in my career, I'm like, oh wow, this is actually more complicated than just you know I
Yeah.
just do it, and I was good at doing stuff, and now I'm gonna make that's again that point of Mary and I, like I'm just gonna make this guy do what I was doing, and what I really want to do is get him sort of engaged again and enrolled in this idea of this is valuable, and this is valuable for me, meaning for Travis, you know, this is valuable as well.
Oh, I love that's a great story. We've all had those. We've all had those moments. When you get these three different roles, in this middle management, which one do you think is the hardest one to master?
It's a really good question, and I would say that they are all hard to master, but you kind of end up, I think, if you really, sort of as you move up your career, I think you master different ones at different times, right?
Okay.
So,
Right.
um, so the doer role, I mean, we sort of start to master the doer role when we're an individual contributor.
Right.
Um, uh, it's interesting though, is as you move up sort of the ladder, the corporate ladder, or whatever it is, that role of doer, the relationship between you and your boss becomes actually more and more complicated. And one of the things that's really interesting that I've actually been doing some training on recently, but I've never been trained on myself, is like training people to manage up is you know, I'm like, it's so valuable, but it actually is a skill that like when you were super junior and you're just like, your boss is just mostly directing you,
Right.
you actually don't need as much managing up skills. As you sort of move up and your boss is actually busy and pulled in a million different directions and whatever, where you actually have to learn how to sort of manage your boss and manage your boss's time and their insecurities and all that kind of stuff. So that actually, I think, can be quite a challenging, one to address. I think
Yeah.
the leadership role is interesting. Like it gets harder. I think it's very hard at the beginning as a
Yeah.
leader because you are so steeped in that doer mindset that you're just I mean, I'm sure you've seen this a million times where people, when they're leading, and they're not getting the results they want, they do the one thing that is like the absolute worst thing to do, which is they jump in and do it themselves, right?
Right.
Which is because they're like so focused on how is this going to make me look, my own insecurities, and so I'm just gonna don't worry about it, I'll do it. Is
Right.
it's worse for it's bad for everyone, right? It's bad for the person who feels demoralized. It's bad for you because your team is actually not learning how to do it. So next time you're gonna have to do it again, all that kind of stuff. So that one I think is hard. It's interesting. I always say to people that when I finally learned sort of, I feel like, how to be a good leader was when I was given a role where I was leading people who were doing things that I had no idea how to do myself.
Oh,
Be-
that's really interesting. Yeah.
Like I
Really rely on their skill set.
Right. So it forces you out of the role of marionetting because I don't know how to do like data engineering or whatever. I don't know how to do that. So I have to rely on you and your skill. And so all of my conversation with my people, all of the conversations with my people became about how do you get the most out of your team? Where are you running into obstacles? How do you sell in your ideas? Which is really what you're trying to do as a leader, is elevate the conversation.
I do love the managing up. We talk a lot about that. We work, we work with all levels of management, and that managing up piece can be very challenging because as you get better as a middle manager, as you get better at your position, sometimes though your supervisor, you become a little bit of a threat. And
Yeah.
so that can be, and those are realities in corporate America.
Yeah.
So I find that's really fascinating. So, when you think about these leaders and you think about these organizations, what are some of the most common mistakes that organizations make in their support or non-support of this middle team?
Yeah. I mean, I think you and I would probably both agree, like maybe the most common mistake they make is that they don't invest in training their middle folks, right? And and what I've seen, and I've talked to so many in the past year, sort of the process of writing a book and starting to talk about this stuff a lot. Um, I've talked to a lot of HR folks, and what they often tell me is it's not that we don't want to train the middle or that um, we don't believe that they need to be trained. It's that there are often so many of them that the belief is we can't afford to train them all. And so what we do is we just train the high potential people. Um, and, and I mean, you probably have at your fingertips more stats on this than I do, but, um, I feel like I'm often read stats about like companies that actually train their middle folks, really do get a return on that investment, but it is an investment. Um,
Mhm.
I think I mean, the middle, you made this point before, the middle folks are they're such a lever, right? They are the ones that are sort of translating the strategy into like actual action. And I don't know how many times, I mean, I'm sure you see this all the time. I've seen so many organizations across my career where the leadership at the top comes up with a strategy and then nothing
Yes.
else.
Right.
And they often blame, well, the middle folks didn't do it or whatever. It's like, first of all, I mean, you mentioned the sort of radical extreme, highly effective atomic ownership mindset. Well, it's like, I always say, you always have to start pointing fingers at you, right? Like, what's my contribution to this? So when leaders say, like, wait, just like, your people aren't out. Nobody comes to work every day thinking, how can I mess with my boss? Like that's just not their approach. So I think, the interesting question is, hey, people saying I can't afford to train my middle is, can you really afford not to train your middle?
Right.
Because, right.
It's
Because
turnover. Yeah,
right.
that turnover, that losing people, all of that. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but
No,
it
no,
is.
no. Yeah.
It's
Well, and
it's
have you read the book? Do you know Liz Wiseman's book, Multipliers? Have you ever come across this book?
no. Oh, I'm gonna write that down.
Yes, a great book. But she talks about this idea of, great leaders as multipliers. And she
Right.
also talks about the opposite of a multiplier, which she calls a diminisher. Um, and the problem is when you have if your middle folks are not trained, then they're as likely to become diminishers, or maybe more likely to become diminishers as they are to become multipliers. If you can get them to become multipliers, your organization has so much more capacity and so much more room for growth. Whereas if they are diminishers, they literally are taking, the organization and just contracting its ability
Yeah.
to do anything and limiting what it can do. And so I really believe that training folks is the key. So I would say that's the biggest mistake, is that assumption that if I train the middle, it's just going to be a waste,
Yeah.
and not seeing the value.
Agree totally with that. You're you want to, where's out to the middle managers, when we talk with executives, we're like, we want you to develop people that are reporting to you to replace you. So that gives you more opportunity to
Mhm.
grow. And that concept seems to just fall either flat or I don't know. But
Yeah.
it's super interesting. And middle is just so crazy.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears for a moment to find something I found so compelling. Your leadership philosophy and you've created this blended framework inspired by big name books, right? Radical Candor, Extreme Ownership, and the 7 Habits, Atomic Habits, right? And Mindsets. So you've kind of combined a bunch of these things. I love Atomic Habits, by the way. I'm in the middle of practicing that for my health. So I'm
That's
like,
awesome.
book, I'm like, let's go. But you turned that into what you call atomic ownership mindset. So how
Right.
did you land on this philosophy? Obviously, you've read a lot, you've done a lot of work, you've had your own, a ton of experiences throughout your book. Have you seen it play out in your own leadership journeys? Kind of bring us through that.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I see a lot of when I'm out, working with companies, coaching, whatever, is this sense of victimization.
Mhm.
People feel like they are victims. Like they're like, oh, I have a micromanaging boss. My boss is terrible. My organization is toxic. I and it's like people feel like things are happening to them, right?
Yeah.
And what I realized, I guess it was really sort of after I wrote the book and was talking to so many people about these concepts, was that my book is actually about saying, well, wait a second. Like, yes, all these things are happening in around you, right? In the context around you. And yes, your boss should treat you differently, and your colleagues should be listening to you, and your people should, know how to do their jobs, whatever. And fundamentally, my whole book is about this idea of, yeah, but they don't.
Right.
Yes. Question
Not rocket science, they just don't.
right? So the question was, what are you going to do about it, right? Victimization mindset says, I am just a victim of my circumstances. There's nothing I can do, and I am stuck. And the reality is, if you shift your mindset to say, okay, all these things are happening, they are all true. There's a million things that people should be doing that they are not doing. What can I do about it? What am I going to do that's going to change this? And so part of the reason the subtitle of my book is a toolkit for middle managers, was this idea of, like, if I give you more tools,
Yeah.
like sort of that, Maslow, quote about, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything is, you treat everything like it's a nail, right? Or whatever.
Yes.
So what if I give you more tools and you have more things that you can do in any given situation? gives you this, sense that, wow, there's a lot more that I have control over than I, would have ever imagined. In fact, I was training a group of folks a couple weeks ago, and it was actually, I was training the whole group, right? From individual contributors all the way up to senior leaders. But it was really interesting when I spent some time with the middle leaders, because they were the ones that were like, wow, we had no idea how much control that we actually have. And so it's that idea that there's so many more things that, we actually have control over, that we, that we often sort of miss and think that we don't have control over them. And that it's not like, it may not be the way that we'd like it to be, right? But we still have control. So if you indulge me for a second, I'm going to tell you a quick story that a recent story that I just love telling the story, because it's, so I was talking to this woman, probably back in the fall. And I see this person maybe once every 3 or 4 months. So I saw this person back in the fall, and we had lunch, and she's like, I have a micromanaging boss. And I always, my advice to people who have a micromanaging boss is like, I call it feeding the beast. You just need to, like, it's a credibility issue. They don't trust you. That's why they're micromanaging you. And you always say to people, just because they don't trust you does not mean you are not trustworthy. But you need to create trust. And so just give them more details, give them the thing they want, and they will eventually back off. And so I told her this, and she goes off and she does this. And then three or so months later, I see her and I said, how's it going? And she said, it was going great. Like, I tried some of the things you said, and my boss totally changed. Everything got better, whatever. And then I went on vacation for 2 weeks. When I came back, my boss was right back to the way they were. And I was so frustrated. And I go, right, because your boss never changed. And she's like, what are you talking about? Like, my boss was totally different. Like, no, your boss wasn't different. You were prompting your boss differently. I started calling this boss GPT, right? Like,
I want to get to that. Yeah.
you were prompting your boss differently.
Oh.
That's why your boss changed. And I said, do you know how I know that? I know that because when you went on vacation, you stopped prompting your boss went right back to the way they were, which is exactly what you would expect. So it's funny. So fast forward another 3 months later, last couple of weeks, I saw this person again. I said, how's it going? And she just started laughing, and she goes, it's like I have a little Jeff Sigel on my shoulder.
Yeah.
But it's this idea of like, you have more control, and how you prompt the people around you is going to change the way they behave. You can't change them. And so sitting around thinking, gosh, I really wish my boss were different, is not going to make anything happen. Or getting mad or losing your temper or telling them they need to change isn't going to make, they will not change. You have to change you, but you have to first recognize that there's so many more things that you can do in order to prompt.
I love that. Yeah, just you think of the prompt engineers and all of that. It's like, it's the same thing. We're just using communication differently.
Yes.
I think that's great advice. And she must be just cracking up, like on my shoulder. You hear it a lot, right? Especially if you coach in companies for a while, and you know people, and they're like, "Well, there was an issue." Just
Yeah.
but it's really fun, isn't it? Though
Yes.
it's really fun to have people kind of have those aha moments where they're like, oh, I'm not a victim, and this person is this way. I recently was on vacation, and I was talking with a friend. So she was a bunch of us went away, and someone brought her sister-in-law, and I didn't know her really that well, but we got to know each other on the trip. And she started talking to me about her job and what's going on, and with a coworker. And I was like, you just got to tell her, like, you got to explain to her what your communication style is, so that she understands what your style is. Like, you're not a fluffy, warm and fuzzy. Just let her know that. Like, I just want the facts. Like, I don't need that. If you do, then I'll give it to you, right? Kind of thing. And she was like, it's interesting. I'm like, you and I, and to people in our space, we're like, oh, that's just real. That's just real. There's nothing rocket science about this. And I love your minimum management kind of philosophy, because in our work, in the work that we do with People Profit, if you're well-oiled machine inside, you've got managers that are managing, they're getting the day-to-day tasks done, they're all moving and shaking. Your clients are going to get really great service, you
Yes.
know, and because there's no infighting, none of that junk, that happens. So
Yeah.
fascinating. So
Absolutely.
yeah. Yeah. So the workplace is changing really fast, right? New tech, new expectations, hybrid, remote, little, some people in the office, some not in the office. There's a major mind shift about leadership right now. And you pointed out what separates people now is mindset. So talk a little bit about that. So if they have the growth mindset, they'll thrive. We talked about the victim mindset. How
Right.
can a leader spot that victim mindset in themselves? So if they are experiencing that,
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think the signs of victim mindset, and I sort of hinted at this a little bit before, are is the word should.
okay, yeah,
Um, uh, and actually, it's funny. I was coaching someone recently, and I was saying, I want you to look for where there are either shoulds or implied shoulds in your world, right? Because that is almost always the sign that victimization is like, my boss should do this, my coworker, should do that, my people, shouldn't show up in my office and ask me all these questions, whatever. It's like, again, this question of like, but they do, right? And so
right.
the should is like, it's kind of that's kind of like the trigger word of like victimization. And it's interesting because the flip side of that, I was seeing the other thing I asked this person to do is, can you look for places where you find yourself feeling resentful of somebody else? I said,
Mm,
because that is usually the sign that there's a should coming from them, right? They think you should do, like your boss thinks you should be doing something, and you are like getting frustrated and resentful, and you're like, I'm not set up for success, and all that stuff is like, that's usually the sign that there's a should coming your way. Right. And so the way to deal with that is to sort of say, I got to get out of this world of what should happen and get into the world of what will happen. I love the example that you just gave of this, the person you went on vacation with is essentially what you're doing is like, we have to make this conversation of you should do that and you should do this, which is a conversation about expectations. And we have to turn it into a conversation about agreements. I will do this and you will do that. Because if we both are thinking of shoulds, we're both sitting in this victim mindset or whatever, like, oh, you should do this and I think you should do that or whatever, and we're having this conflict. The Regardless of the problem is I have a story in my head, you have a story in your head, and those stories aren't matching up. I don't
stories.
Right? I don't need the stories to match up if I have an agreement. If you do this, I will do that. If I do this, you will do that. Whatever. That's an agreement, and it doesn't matter anymore what this. I can have whatever story I want in my head, but I agreed to do something, and you agreed to do something, and we will do it. And if we don't, then we have to have a conversation of why are we not meeting up to these agreements. That's a different story. So to me, the sign of victimization is the word should. I would say it's like one of the worst words. I mean, there's a lot of awful words in the language, but it is, if you move past those, like it is one of the worst words in terms of like mindset, when it's like everybody should be doing all kinds of things again, but they don't. So what are you?
Right.
Running a business is hard. Developing your people shouldn't be. At Human Power Solutions, we act as your outsourced chief learning officer, designing custom learning and development experiences that actually move the needle. No fluff, no cookie-cutter workshops, just results. Whether your people need better communication, stronger leadership, or less burnout, we provide strategic solutions that align with your goals and keep your team moving forward. Visit hpowersolutions.com and unlock your team's full potential without disrupting operations.
What advice would you give, like some of the small but powerful ways to build a growth mindset, especially in the middle of an organization? So, talking to senior leaders, talking to that senior leader, that business owner, that CEO, C-suite group, like what are some of the tools and tips that they can use to kind of give that power?
Yes.
mindset to the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'm going to bring up two things. One is what I was just talking about is I think explicitly sharing this idea of expectations versus agreements and agreeing that we are going to work in agreements can be one of the most empowering things. Um, um, the second thing though is I have this set of questions. I need to like find a company that's willing to like test this theory out, right? I have this set of questions that I believe could totally change a culture from a fixed to a growth mindset. And the three questions are: one, what did you learn? The second question is, how did you grow your team? And the third question is, who did you help? And I am convinced if you ask those three questions of, say, if a CEO were asking their executive team all the time, you knew that your CEO was going to ask you, what did you learn this week? You would learn something, right? You knew that your CEO might ask you, how did you grow your team this week? You would do something to grow your team, right? And if you knew that your CEO is going to ask, like, who outside of your direct organization did you help? You would become more collaborative. And if you then push this down to like all the way down to like, hey, in one-on-ones, I literally want manager and individual contributor to like, what did you learn? Who did you help? Asking those questions all the time will lead to a organization that is more focused on personal growth, more focused on team growth, and more on collaboration, which, by the way, are all the things that lead to an organization being really, really. That's my. So I give that advice all the time. I'd love to at some point find a company and be like, can we test this out? Like, let's just do this and see what happens. Because I think I bet you would change the culture of an organization extremely quickly if you started asking those questions.
I love that. I can think of several, so we can chat after this. So you're not leading a team directly right now, right? But you're constantly coaching, developing others, right? What's something surprising or powerful that you've learned recently from any of your training and coaching experiences you've had?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll get a little bit more sort of on the personal side is I think that I have been learning because of all this training and coaching and that I'm doing of others is I'm discovering all the places where I get stuck myself and I get into a sort of fixed mindset or whatever. And I sometimes refer to that sort of Carol Dweck fixed mindset as the achiever mindset. Because many of us in our careers are like, we believe that we are the sum of our achievements, meaning I am my degrees, my promotions, my titles, and whatever. And what I feel like I've learned, sort of say over the last year or so is that mindset of I am my achievements is actually it's very limiting, right? There's this great story, and I can't remember which of Brene Brown's books, but
love her.
She is great. But in one of her books, she tells a story of an Olympian who had just won gold. Is home sitting at her kitchen table a couple weeks later, and she's crying. And her mother walks in to the room and says to her, "Why are you crying? You just won gold at the Olympics. You're amazing, whatever." And the daughter says to her mother, "I thought I would feel different." And I think that the problem with this mindset where we focus on our achievements is that the moment we achieve the thing, our brain moves on and says, okay, that's done. What's next? Actually, a funny story about this. I was talking to a former direct report of mine had just gotten promoted, I think from like senior manager to director. And so I called him up just to congratulate him, and we're chatting, and he says, yeah, I came home and told my wife I was just promoted to director. And she said, congratulations, but how long before you start stressing about being VP? And I'm like, that's exactly right, right? Like that's what we do. We get so focused on achieve. instead of like, what am I learning along the way? And so this has been a really interesting challenge for me, having shifted gears from being a corporate guy, working for people, to right now having my own, small businesses that I'm building, is that you have to get out of that like achieve mindset, and really recognize that the real value is, I know it sounds a little trite, but the real value is the journey, right? It's the learning. I
Right.
say, like, how do you get people to shift their mindset so that they're less focused on the punctuation and more focused on the sentences?
Interesting. Yeah. I met with my mentor before I went on vacation, and we had lunch, and I hadn't seen him in quite a while. And, I'd gotten the book written, and we're doing all this stuff. And I'm like, and I'm that what's next person. Like, what's next? What's next? And he used a really cool phrase. He's like, it's called success unrest. You have your success, but you've got that. And he basically, that advice he gave to me, he goes, look at where you started 5 years ago. And he's like,
Right.
you lost your job. And he's like, and now look at all of that. And he really made me step back and say, okay, you're right. But it's really interesting to think about what you do learn along the way, and being an entrepreneur for you, like coming out of corporate and stepping into this world of entrepreneurship and owning a small business. You have to have the stomach for it.
Yeah.
And it's that's a whole other podcast we can really take. But in your middle management, when you're promoted, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, now
Right.
you have to think, you've got to start thinking less about yourself, more about what's happening in the organization. And it's almost like you're in the entrepreneurial spirit, because you've got to figure out a way to motivate others. And there's going to be dips and valleys all along the way. And it's not always going to go well. How do you
Right.
help that middle management, the first time, if they have someone that's micromanage, or if they make a big mistake that costs money, in their, today's world, people are
Right.
so devastated by that. How do you help people get through that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I love that. I think it's like a Jack Welch story, the one where it was like, I don't know if you know the one I'm talking about, where, somebody made like a $10 million mistake, and he goes into his boss's office and said that, I made this mistake, and I fully expect that you're going to fire me. And the guy was like, fire you? I just spent $10 million training. And so, think that, it's interesting. So connecting the dots here of that achiever, one of the real problems with that achiever mindset is that in the high pressure corporate world that is so focused on that sort of achievement model,
Right.
is that you as a employee are like, I'm the sum of my achievements, right? And so as you move up the ladder and get more and more achievements, you're watching people make missteps, have something bad happen, whatever, and they're basically falling by the wayside. And you're looking to like, oh, I'm so much better than that because I didn't fall by the wayside and I moved up. And the problem with that is that I actually think this sometimes makes the people that who survive, and get there, some of them insecure and unsatisfied people in the world, because they're like, there for the grace, I go, right? Like, I then make one misstep and I am going to fall off this ladder. And so this constant sense of like anxiety and whatever. And so I think the key is, again, goes back to this, like, if you want to help people become more, sort of, I don't know, I guess, resilient and so forth, is you have to basically, as an organization, recognize that mistakes happen. I have this quote, I don't even think it's in my book. I think I put it in an article, like, some months later, but this quote of, delegation is a leap of faith, not that your team will always get it right, but that they will sometimes get it wrong and it will still be okay. Right. I think that idea of, I need to train people to recognize that mistakes are how we learn and grow. And that in some ways, if we are not, there's another quote, John Wooden, if you're not making mistakes, you're not doing anything. Right.
Yep.
Like, like if we're not making mistakes, it means that we've become too sort of, stuck in, the rut of, easy and so forth. And so,
Maybe not easy, but maybe just status quo,
right, right,
right?
right, or just status quo, comfortable, and whatever. And comfortable is not how companies grow, right? Companies not how people grow. And so, I think the real interesting question, and I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts, and in sort of your business, how you address this, but is how do you train people to essentially look, to see those mistakes and those and those sort of learning moments as learning moments, and stop seeing them as like a disaster, a failure, I'm going to fall apart and whatever.
Yeah,
um
we do a lot of the after action reviews, right? The AARs, right? So
yeah,
something doesn't go well, doesn't go according to plan. Well, what went wrong? What went right? What will we do
right,
the next time? So I think, sometimes we make a mistake and we think it's an all-consuming mistake, but it might be something very small in the grand scheme of things. So you do have to look at the things that, well, what worked in that process, for them, but it's also helping the executive teams and the senior leadership teams, understand that in order for you to build trust with these managers and get them to do what you need to do and free yourself up, they're going to make mistakes. So we
yeah,
set that up in the beginning. We're like, you're going to give them something and you've got to let go. And they may not do it exactly the way you do it.
right.
It's how the senior leadership handles those mistakes.
Yeah, and I think related to that is this idea of, um, how do actually, I'm going to jump back to something you said earlier. You were talking about this idea of people training people to, to do their job, right?
Mhm.
I think people often misunderstand that. I think what they think is, they think that what that means is I need to train people so that they can be promoted into my job. And it's like,
Right.
no, 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 that's not what this is about. This is, I am training you to do what I do so that I don't have to do it anymore. And so I strongly believe that the role of the leader is to create the conditions, like you said, where you trust your team to function at a high level, even when you are not there. And if they cannot do that right now, then it is your job as the leader to train them, give them more information,
Mhm.
teach them, create the conditions, change the processes, whatever it is, so that you don't have to be there. That's, I tell a story in my book about a leader who essentially went on vacation for 3 weeks during a period of time where there was just a lot of complicated, bad stuff happening, whatever. And when she came back, she's like, how did it go? Because she'd been gone for a couple of weeks, and it was fine. Your team was great. I said, it is the sign of a true leader that your team can function that well when you are away on vacation, right? You should train them, and they didn't freak out. They were on top of things, whatever. They were trained to do it. And so I think, but you have to, you have to create the conditions for um for people to, learn and grow. And sometimes that means, like, I was talking about this the other day to someone, like, well, if you basically ask somebody to write a strategy and they've never written a strategy before, and you just say write the strategy, and they will show up with something that's crap, right? They will, like, I guarantee, because they've never done it before, right? And so I'm like, well, what if you started out by just saying, hey, I need you to write an outline for your strategy. Like, don't give them the whole, like, give them with to learn, but give them a task that isn't going to be the whole, everything's, um, sort of dependent on them getting it right, because 3 weeks later, when it's due in a day, you're going to basically go, oh, I guess I got to redo this myself.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It happens so often. And you also, I love that the concept of the chaos cycle that you talk about.
Mm.
That breakdown of trust, like we were just talking about there, that impacts everybody. Let's talk about this for a minute. Can you describe the chaos cycle and how it shows up in day-to-day leadership?
Yeah, so the chaos cycle was something that I've started to notice. I noticed it in the corporate world. I noticed it actually in small businesses as well. It's this the cycle sort of works like this. And I often use Stephen Covey's quadrants to kind of, you know, to talk about this idea is that, Stephen Covey talks about if you're supposed to, you have these things that are urgent and important. I always call that firefighting, right? And then you have stuff that is important but not urgent. This is like setting process and whatever. And I always ask people, I say, well, if you spend zero time on things that are important but not urgent, what happens? And the answer is that everything ends up in the firefighting, right? More and more stuff will end up in the firefighting bucket until, I used to say, until you hit the capacity of the organization. Except that what I eventually realized was it actually goes until you hit way beyond the capacity of the organization, because you are capable as a team of functioning sort of at a sort of revved up, red line kind of, level for a certain amount of time. Like I can work weekends and nights or whatever for a week or two, whatever. So at some point, then what happens is that, so now now you're redlined, but you are still making stuff happen. So you redline all the time, right? Which leads to, of course, burnout. And so what inevitably happens is somebody gets fed up with this situation in some form and they quit. And when they quit, what it does is it creates more pressure on that organization, because now they have to absorb all the work that person was doing. So now more people burn out and more people quit, right? And so the interesting question is, so what are the root causes of this thing? I would argue that there's sort of three things that happen. One is at the lowest levels, you have victimization, a bunch of people who are feeling like all this craziness, this chaos is happening to them.
Right.
And the next level up, the middle layer, does what I call crisis leadership. This is like, we go from one crisis to the next crisis, to the next crisis, to the next crisis. And in some ways actually start creating the crises because they've become a bottleneck in the system, because everything has to go through them. I can't trust anybody. Somebody's going to make a mistake, whatever. And so they become this sort of limiting factor.
Right.
And at the top level, the issue is that the reason that all of this was happening is because the leadership didn't trust their team. Usually the thing that kicks off this chaos cycle is something went wrong. Back to our conversation before, something went wrong, a mistake was made. And so leadership's like, all right, we got to come at this like a ton of bricks, right? We're going to be on top of this, whatever. And all that does is constrain things, when the reality is you have to be like, okay, a mistake happens. To your point, let's do the after action report. Let's learn it. And let's trust that the team is not going to make the same big mistake again, because we spent time, like they don't like it either, right? They didn't make a mistake on purpose. They just didn't know. And now that they know, we have to let them, do it. And yes, a mistake could happen again. In fact, a mistake will happen again. But what I would say is, when you get into that chaos cycle, mistakes happen because people are moving too fast. I would much rather have a mistake happen because people don't know something and they need to learn it, than that they make it because they know something, but they are just moving so fast that they can't, because there's no learning there. They know it was a mistake. It was just, I was too busy. I missed this, whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. When we think about, when I talk with managers, and I'm sure when you do too, it's like when you're first delegating something to somebody, when you're giving someone a new task, having that conversation of, I'm not micromanaging you, I'm going to check in because I want to make sure that you're learning what you need to learn.
Right.
And so, like you said earlier, when you set those expectations, this check-in is not because I don't trust you. It's because I'm going to be here to help you learn, to make sure that you're going on the right track, so you're not frustrated. And I think that it just setting those expectations, having those conversations up front, really help build trust, between the two people, and like you said, giving someone a big project, if they've never, like I was working with a client who asked someone to write a grant, and person had never written one before.
Right.
The expectation was, well, you're so good at everything that you do. And she's like, I just never done it.
Right.
And that's frustrating for that, for that person, and for the leader too, because then it falls back on them to kind of get it done. Super interesting there. What's one, what do you think one intervention, you see this kind of happening? How do you break that cycle before it just goes out of control and spirals?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there are a couple things. I think, one of them is the leader has to be the one who says, we're going to step back and look at what is, like we're going to get into that quadrant 2, that important but not urgent. And I am going to allow the team to do the stuff that they're doing, but I'm going to spend time looking at what is it, where can I fix things, and where can I change things, or where can this process get better? The only way to get out of this is somebody is going to have to put in the work to find the better way. And if not, you will just always be like, yeah, but there's something more urgent than this. And it's like, somebody has to sort of be the person that goes, the urgent thing right now is to fix what's broken. It's like, I don't know, I just often tell people, like, it's like that thing that they tell you on the plane, like you have to put your oxygen mask on first, right? It's like, because when we're panicked in that moment and the crisis is happening, our tendency is like, I want to help the people around me or whatever it is, just get stuff done. And it's like, yeah, but if you don't put the oxygen mask on you won't be helping people for very long.
Yeah. And also, somebody else's urgent doesn't necessarily have to be your urgent. And in that middle management, class of employees, when someone pops something in and says, I need this done, and they're working out 3 other things that need to get done, helping them to stop and say, okay, I'm working on this, and this. Where would you like me to be? And that's part of that managing up process.
Yeah.
Because like, oh, I forgot that you're working on this. I can give this to somebody else, kind of thing. But it's a tough one. That matrix is fun, because it's like, do you really need? Is that really urgent?
Yes.
That.
It's just a really powerful tool to help people. It's like prioritize and think about their work.
Love it. So how, this has been great. You've shared your wisdom, your stories, your frameworks. I love all the frameworks. Your work is really making a difference in helping leaders thrive. I just think, it's messy. It can be very rewarding, right? And just often the very misunderstood middle. They're not appreciated as much as they should be, Yeah. So for those of you that want to connect with you, how do they do that? And how to get your book? We'll put a link to your book in our.
Awesome. So my book, The Middle Matters, A Toolkit for Middle Managers, is the easiest way to get it is on Amazon. And the best places to reach me. So my author site is jeffsigel.com. So JEFFSIGEL.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn under Jeff Sigel. I'm the Jeff Sigel that's talking about middle management. So
we'll put that link in there too.
Awesome. Yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for all your time today. And we had a little technical difficulties in the beginning, so thanks for your patience with that. I really appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.
Yep, you too. Thanks so much.
That's a wrap on this episode of the People Profit Podcast. If you found a nugget of wisdom or even just a spark of inspiration, share the love, subscribe, leave us a review, and pass the episode along to a colleague who's ready to build a people-first culture. Big thanks to our sponsor, Human Power Solutions, for championing workplace where humans thrive and profits rise. Want to learn how they can energize your team? Head over to hpowersolutions.com to get started. I'm Sandra Coker, reminding you that when you invest in people, you invest in profit. See you next time.